Do you think you could be thankful in those circumstances? Would you call that when it rains, it pours? I wonder, how much watching had been done with Job before God called upon him to suffer those things. And when you look at it and you see these things, we understand what God thought about Job. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But I want you to think about what you could be thankful for. Is there a set of circumstances that would allow you to be thankful for something like that happening to you? In Acts the 5th chapter, we have the escalating of the persecution against the saints. Remember when it first started out, actually before the day of Pentecost, while the Lord was still here, he started telling his disciples, now, I don't want you to think that they're going to treat you any better than they treat me. A servant is not above his master, nor is a student above the teacher. So whatever they do to me, they're going to do to you, and sometimes even worse, perhaps. So it started out, this persecution, and on the day of Pentecost, they heard the apostles speaking in tongues, and that got everybody's attention, and the sound of the rushing wind and the tongues like a fire settling on each one of them got everybody in Jerusalem's attention, anybody close to the temple anyway. And so everybody was gathered around and everybody was listening to this, and people were amazed. That's kind of what we talk about the miracles. They were signs, and they were wonders. Starts out as a miracle that becomes a wonder. It makes, what? And after that, for some, it becomes a sign. Miracles are things that humans can't do, cannot do. And to those who see them, the first thing that happens is you go, what in the world? And then when you start paying attention, it becomes a sign, a signature of God. That's kind of interesting. Well, to some on that day, it was a sign because they understood no man can do that. But there was a group there. There's always a bunch. Some that just can't accept it. They're drunk. Think about that for a minute, what an insult that was. Because the drunk can't even speak in his own language, let alone 17 different languages at the same time and be understood by everybody that was there. Nobody can do that. Then, next thing was in chapter 4, they, after healing the lame man at the gate of the temple, Peter and John were arrested. And they took them into custody, and they threatened them. Said, don't you dare do this anymore, teach in this man's name. And Peter asked the question, he says, you be the judge. Should we obey God or men? Then later on, they were arrested again. That time it was just Peter and John. But next time, it's the whole group of the apostles are arrested. This time, they don't know what to do with them. Matter of fact, the Sanhedrin made the statement, the fact that a notable miracle has been done, we can't deny, but what are we going to do about it? How are we going to stop this thing? They wanted to kill him. But Gamaliel, Paul's teacher, obviously a wise man, one that knew and understood things that had happened in the past, because he gave a list of those that had risen up to be rebellious, and he said, listen now, don't be careful what you do with these men, because if they're not from God, it'll just go away. But if they are, we're going to find ourselves fighting against God. He said, leave them alone. Well, they didn't quite leave them alone. This time they beat them and warned them if they ever did it again, it's going to be worse. But here's what I want you to read. After Gamaliel gave that advice, here's what we find in Acts chapter 5. beginning in verse 40, it says, they took his advice, partly, almost took his advice. And after calling the apostles in, they flogged them and ordered them not to speak in the name of Jesus, and then they released them. So, they went on their way from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they had been considered worthy to suffer shame for his name. And every day in the temple and from house to house, they kept right on teaching and preaching Jesus as the Christ. Exactly what they were told not to do. Now, you know, I understand about these men. I do. Because they've been with the Lord for 3 years, and the Lord gave them warning that they're going to have to suffer. They deserted him at first, but now they're back. Now they're back, and they are all in for this cause. You know, so many of us, as Christians, born again Christians, born into the body of Christ, wonder, why me? Why me? Why me? And I understand that, because we're going to see one of the greatest men in the history of the world say, why me? So many of us ask that. But you know what? You take an elite force, you take our special ops guys, the top tier operators and the firefighters and anti-terror groups and these Coast Guard rescue guys. I have so much admiration for them. You ever watch Deadliest Catch with them in the middle of the winter? They fly those helicopters out there and they risk their lives in that environment to save people. They don't ask, why me? You don't find those guys asking, why me? Not while they're doing their duty, because they knew what they were getting into and they signed up for that. They're willing to do that, and they train to do that. They give up everything to do that. So they don't ask, why me? Ron brought up December 7th, Pearl Harbor. My father-in-law was on a ship in the middle of that. His ship was one of the only ones that was left that they didn't sink because it was insignificant. He was on a little tiny tender. They didn't find it important. They sank everything around it. There were guys screaming and moaning and crying, and things were tough. But I don't know how much why me there was at that time. You know, these guys who sign up for it, there comes a time when they say, why me? But that's when they've done their duty, they've been hurt or wounded, and then the people that they signed up to serve abandoned them. Then they say, why me? Something that we ought to think about in the process. But I want to get to Job here, because I want to think about this man who did not sign up for it, or at least he didn't know he did. But God chose this man, and I want to read why. In chapter 1, beginning in verse 5 of Job, it says, when the days of feasting had completed their cycle, Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. He had a lot of kids. And he would offer sacrifices for every one of his kids, just in case they had done something wrong. Not only for himself, but for all of his kids. He would offer these sacrifices. This is a man who cares about what's right and wrong. It said, perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. This is not a one-time thing. This is the character of the man that we call Job. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. You know what the word Satan means? I've often wondered about this. Satan means the opposition, who stands against, the accuser, he's called. I wonder, did God give him that name at his creation, or is this something that he earned? Is this something that Satan developed and was named this, like Barnabas was named son of exhortation? Because Michael, on the opposite end of this, Michael was the trusted, faithful one who is named, who is as God. So it makes you wonder, just one of those things that makes me go, The Lord said to Satan, from where do you come? Satan answered, from roaming about on the earth and walking around on it. The Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, where there's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil? Now, I want you to think about this, because this is how God feels about this man. We're going to see a lot of talk. We're going to read a lot of things about what everybody else thought about this man. But I want you to understand how God felt about this individual right here. And it helps us to understand why he's in the position that he's in right now. Just like some of these top tier operators, they're chosen because of what somebody sees in them. And they're given an opportunity to join this, whatever it is, this force. And then they're trained beyond belief to live up to that responsibility. But here's a man who on his own has developed the kind of character that God says there's nobody like him on the earth. What a statement. What a reputation. This reminds me of Daniel, when Daniel has Gabriel come to him, and Gabriel, who stands in the presence of God, says to Daniel, "O man of high esteem." Wow! Someone who is looked up to from heaven. That's quite a statement. Now, here's this man who God says to Satan, "You think you can get anyone? Have you considered my servant Job? He's upright in every way. This man is as close to flawless as they come on the earth." God let Satan hurt him bad. Hurt him bad because there's a purpose. This man has been chosen. I want you to read what his friends say after they come to see Job, after all these things happened to him. And Michael read what happened to him time after time, thing after thing, all the way down to where he's lost everything he ever owned. And now God says you can touch him, but you can't kill him. And Satan goes and covers him with sores from the bottom of his feet to the top of his head. How much can one person take? So, Job's friends hear about this. Actually, there's 4 friends. We start out with 3. These first 3 friends are older men, and we sang in the song about the aged and the children alike. Well, these are the aged ones. It says, when Job's 3 friends heard of all this adversity that had come upon him, they came each one from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. And they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and to comfort him. When they lifted up their eyes at a distance, they did not recognize him. They raised their voices and wept, and each of them tore his robe, and they threw dust over their heads toward the sky. And when they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him. for they saw that his pain was very great. Nice to have friends, isn't it? It's wonderful to have friends. Friends to comfort you when things go wrong.
Amen.
Yeah. Too bad Job didn't have them. They came and they sat. And they sat there looking at Job for 7 days and 7 nights, and nobody said a word. But then, like quite often happens, sympathy and support quickly turn to self-righteous judgment. They went from sympathy to, in Job chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, Eliphaz. Eliphaz. I tried to find who Eliphaz was, and he's a Temanite. So he comes from the territory that's in Edom, the city of Teman. And Teman is the grandson of Esau, and Eliphaz is the son of Esau. At least an Eliphaz was the son of Esau. This may be the very son of Esau that's coming, because the city, he probably named the city he was living in after his firstborn son, Teman. But here's his first response to Job's defense of himself. He says, remember now, think about this, who ever perished being innocent? Or where were the upright ever destroyed? According to what I have seen, those who plow iniquity and those who sow trouble harvest it. You know what he's saying to Job? You sinner, this couldn't be happening to you if you hadn't done something wrong. Where did that support go? Where did their view of this righteous man, a man that God said nobody on earth is as good as this guy, where did that support go? At an occasion to accuse. They took the occasion. But you know, this is nothing new. This happens all the time. You remember the story in John, the 9th chapter, about the man that was born blind, and the Lord and his disciples were traveling past it, and they saw him. And they said to the Lord, Lord, who sinned? This man or his parents, that he should be born blind? They had the idea that all evil that happens to anybody comes because you sin. I want you to think about this, because these horrible events that took place to Job happened because he was not a sinner, because he was a righteous man, because God used him at that moment. Did we ever think that what we go through might be the same situation as Job? He said, I thought about the Apostle Paul too. When Paul was on his journey back to Rome, when he had appealed to Caesar, he had been in jail for 2 years in Jerusalem. And then he appealed to Caesar from Caesarea. He appealed to Caesar, and they sent him on a boat back to Rome. Well, in the middle of that, it comes a storm, and they get shipwrecked, and they finally barely make it to shore. And the local people felt sorry for them. That's what people do. They feel sorry for somebody that's been in a shipwreck or something like that. Everybody has this sympathy mode, like Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar. They had a sympathy mode. Didn't last long, but they had it. Well, these people, let's read in Acts chapter 28, starting in verse 3. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks, now what happened was that the people of the island, when they saw him coming ashore, they built a fire so they could warm themselves, because it was the winter and it was cold and it was raining. Sympathy. Paul was out there helping gather sticks. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. When the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, "Undoubtedly, without question, this man is a murderer." Whoa! How do we go from sympathy to a murderer in a heartbeat like that? We have this predisposition to judge. It says, "Undoubtedly this man is a murderer, and though he has been saved from the sea, justice," another word for justice here is fate, "fate has not allowed him to live," because the snake bit him and he's going to die. They're standing there watching, waiting for him to swell up, fall down, and go and die. However, he shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm. You remember what Jesus said about snakes will bite you, drink poison, and nothing will happen to them? I'm talking about these apostles. Said, when he shook it off after that, they waited a long time and they had seen nothing unusual happen to him. Then they changed their minds again and began to say that he was a god. Boy, we are a fickle bunch of people, aren't we? Yo-yos, in and out, up and down, up and down. I get tired of the yo-yo. Job's friends were no different. They were no different. In Job 15, Eliphaz comes back with another rebuttal. Here's what it says. Now I'm just cutting his short because there's a lot of things that he said, but I'm trying to give you the kernel here. "Should a wise man answer with windy knowledge and fill himself with the east wind?" What's he calling Job? Call him a windbag. That's going to come back to haunt him here in a little bit because God's going to say the same thing about him in a little bit. He said, "Should a wise man answer with windy knowledge and fill himself with the east wind? Should he argue with useless talk or with words which are not profitable?" Because obviously Eliphaz knows. Job doesn't know. Job's lying, but Eliphaz knows. And then later he comes back with sarcasm. He says, "Do you hear the secret counsel of God?" Does God speak to you in the middle of the night? Job, is that how you know what you know? Does God speak to you personally and share it with no one else? Do you get the sarcasm there? Where did the friendship go from this man who is supposed to be his longtime friend? I never told you about what Teman was noted for. In Jeremiah chapter 49, I think it is, there's a statement made by Jeremiah about Teman, that it was noted to be a city where wise men dwelt. That was what it was known for around the world, kind of like Solomon. When Solomon had such wisdom, people came from all over the world to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Teman was like that, evidently. And Jeremiah said, what happened to the wisdom of Teman? Is there no wise man there ever anymore? Well, hear this sarcasm from the man who's supposed to be his friend. In Job chapter 22, here's what Eliphaz also says. "Is not your wickedness great?" Now, wait a minute, what did God say about this man? God said about this man that there's no one like him on the earth. He is upright in every way. But Eliphaz, in his own great wisdom, decides that the only reason this could be happening to Job is because he's a sinner. "Is not your wickedness great and your iniquities without end? For you have taken pledges of your brothers without cause and stripped men naked. To weary you have given no water to drink, and from the hungry you have withheld bread." You remember what Jesus said would mark his disciples and people that he knew loved him? Was if they gave food and drink to people who needed it. Well, Eliphaz is accusing Job of not having any of those characteristics, any of those traits. I'm afraid that we have the wrong idea about suffering. we don't ever consider the fact that we might be called upon to be an example to everybody around us by how we handle the things that happen to us. When I look at Job, I see a man who was so confused about what was happening to him. Job did not know. But I'll tell you what he said to his wife. He said, "Should I accept the goodness of God and not the adversity?" He understood that from the very beginning. This was what made Job such a great man. But I'll tell you what, during this trial that he had with his friends, Job began to defend himself to the point where he wasn't right. He was not defending God, he was defending himself. And when Elihu, who was a young man who came and listened to all the rest of them, Elihu said, I'm a young guy here, and I understand you guys are older, and I've been sitting and waiting, listening, waiting for you to finish so that I can say what I think I need to say. And he condemned Job, or not condemned, he chastised Job for not defending God, but defending himself. There's where Job fell a little bit short. And you can see that in chapter 38 when God begins to speak. And God says to Job, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Where were you when I..." And he goes on to talk about all of the acts of creation that are so far above us, we have no clue. He had no idea why God had put him in that position. And I'll tell you what I've learned about Job. I've learned what we're capable of. I've learned what God can use us for when He allows evil to come upon us. God doesn't tempt us. God doesn't do it to us, but God will use us like we use these special people that train to serve us. God used Job to show you and to show me what we're capable of and what it means to trust God in every set of circumstances. Job passed the test, but just barely at the end. Eliphaz condemned Job or chastised Job, and so did God. But he's left for us as an example of someone who stood up and did the right thing. I'd like for us to use that example, think about that example. I'd also like for us to think about the turning that the friends did on Job at the slightest chance to turn against him. If you're in need of the gospel, you know what you need to do in order to be right with God, would you make your life right today as we stand and sing the song that Ron has for us?